Reddit, the place that everyone seems to come up on when needing advice on legal matters. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive on a post that I found on the RBI subreddit about a Redditor asking for help about a coworker harassing their husband.
This is their story.
On February 26, 2021, at 2:23 a.m., a Redditor of the name Bjorn Secular would make a post on the RBI subreddit asking for help about how to deal with a coworker harassing their husband. Their post is as follows. A former coworker is using burner numbers to harass my husband and acting obsessive. In late November of last year, my husband, Paul, was tasked with training a new hire named Frank, who was brought in from outside the company. Paul does not usually lead training, however, Frank's supervisor was overwhelmed during the last quarter. Frank worked at Paul's office for a little over a month. Frank seemed friendly at first, albeit an excessive texter. Even Paul's boss, Frank's future boss's boss, complained that they received social messages from Frank during non-work hours. Sometimes Frank's messages would be incoherent and needier if he did not receive an immediate reply followed by multiple question marks. My husband addressed this with Frank during his training, and for the most part, the messages became infrequent. After Frank was placed at his branch, the messages subsided. In early January, Paul's boss asked if he could discuss a work matter with Frank because whose direct report was on vacation. Later that day, Frank sent Paul a message that said, "Babe." Paul thought perhaps Frank had accidentally texted the wrong person. Paul didn't respond. Frank sent more messages regarding work, and when Paul didn't immediately reply, Frank made a suggestive comment. Paul responded, "Stop making things weird." Frank apologized, but then added, "You're hot though." My husband told him, "You need to stop. This is not a line I want to cross with you." Frank then said something along the lines of he was available if Paul wanted him. Paul said, "I'm a happily married man," to which Frank replied, "That's what all men say." Paul again told Frank to stop. I had previously met Frank when I visited my husband's office. Paul has pictures of me on his desk. His orientation and marital status were not ambiguous when Frank sent those messages. Paul told me what happened as soon as he arrived home from work. I said he should screenshot the messages and report them to HR. However, Paul felt so uncomfortable with the messages, he deleted them. Paul assumed Frank was drunk and once clear of mind, he would be embarrassed to forget that had happened. Over the next few days, Paul received between 2 to 3 messages daily from Frank. They were about work. However, towards the end of the week, Frank became apologetic and told Paul he had hoped they could still be friends. Paul has only briefly known this person, has never hung out with him outside the office, nor has he engaged in social text. Paul has not answered any of Frank's messages since the first time he told him to stop. A couple of things occurred to me over the next week. A week after Frank was placed at his new branch, Paul received messages from an iCloud account. They said, "Hey," when Paul didn't reply, they were followed by a question mark. Paul immediately blocked the account, assuming it was a scammer. In the last few months, Paul received frequent texts from unknown numbers with local area codes that addressed him by name. Paul thought that they were all from scams. I realized that this started around the time Frank began his training. When I visited my husband's office, Frank barely acknowledged me when we were introduced. That night, I joked with my husband that during my visit, Frank was like a shadow and seemed to appear every time I turned around. After a week of unanswered text, Frank again apologized and asked if Paul would call him. He had called Paul's office earlier to see if he was there. Subsequently, Paul contacted his assistant managers / co-workers and asked them to not share his schedule with anyone who calls. Frank messaged that he would stop texting and was sorry if he bothered Paul. Later in the night, Paul started to receive messages from an unknown number with a local area code. The first message said, "Hey, remember me?" I *67 the number from my phone to see if it was a computer or actual phone line. When I called, it rang twice and then went to voicemail. The person never stated their name and the texts were incoherent. The texter asked, "Are you trying to end my career?" They claimed to be a former employee and then said they previously dated Paul. "We have been together for 2 decades and I'm the only person Paul has ever dated." The messages continuously baited Paul to call the number to find out who was texting him. Finally, they said, "You used to be sweet." Paul didn't block the number immediately because he wanted to see if the person would incriminate themselves. Paul received 20 plus messages throughout the night. He never responded to any of them and the number is now blocked. He paid a small fee to look up the number and found that it belongs to Envoy. The person used a VOIP to text. Paul tried to look up a VOIP registry online. Paul reported the anonymous number to the FTC with the text logs. He took screenshots of all the undeleted messages between him and Paul and the anonymous number. Paul also called local law enforcement. He knew they wouldn't be able to do anything because no direct threat was made. They told him to keep the number blocked. Paul paid service to retrieve the text he deleted that came directly from Frank's number, but it was unsuccessful. iCloud backup was not activated. The next week at work, one of Paul's assistant managers approached him. They follow Frank on Facebook and were alarmed by his post. The day after Paul received a text from an unknown number, Frank made similar posts online and added, "With me, you're either ride or die or dead." Paul compiled all the information he had and shared it with his boss and company HR. Over the next few weeks, Paul continued to receive texts from Frank, sometimes one a week or once every other week. After a month-long investigation, HR touched base that their legal department found several red flags. However, they can't disclose info because of confidentiality, nor were they going to fire Frank. Paul has been away on business for the past 2 weeks and I have been home alone. Paul told me he received texts from Frank that asked how his business trip was going. Just to reiterate, Paul hasn't responded to Frank's messages since he told him to stop, which was over a month ago. Last night I saw I had several missed calls from Paul around midnight. When I called him back, I could tell he was worried. Same as before, he started to receive texts from a different number with a local area code. They said, "I miss you, why do you hate me?" The number called him consecutively for an hour. Paul had to turn on the do not disturb option. The following text messages he received were explicit and some referenced me. "For the most part, I feel safe at home. We have a PO box and an unlisted street address. There are exterior and interior cameras at all of the entry points around our home. Also, our neighborhood has 24-hour security. However, I'm worried sick every time Paul leaves the house. We've wanted to start a family for a very long time but have struggled with infertility. Unfortunately, this past month I suffered another miscarriage. This person has added unnecessary stress to our lives. Last night I was shaking and could not sleep. Any advice on how to find out where the texts are coming from or how to handle harassment would be much appreciated. Paul and I already discussed going to the police once he returns home." Edit. More info. We were definitely frustrated with HR's response. My husband was told legal would review all the information he shared. He spoke to them on the phone several times, hour-long conversations. They asked if he felt safe and he said frankly no. Things escalated in such a short period. They took certain precautions, i.e. he was never in the building alone. He didn't work past sunset. He parked towards the front and security made sure cameras are facing the parking lot. They seemed supportive at first. However, the investigation took a month and they told my husband there wasn't enough to fire Frank. The HR rep did say she was surprised by legal's resources. She didn't realize how much they have access to, and that they found several red flags, but they were unable to share what they found or when/if Frank would be disciplined. Everything was treated like it was supposed to go back to normal, even though it doesn't seem like it was discussed with Frank, nor did it stop. Redditors would begin to give their suggestions as to how to deal with the situation. One Redditor would give some excellent advice, with them stating, "First off, I'm so sorry you and your husband are dealing with this. It's such a terrible and stressful situation. I hope it is resolved quickly. I do HR investigations for a living, so I'm going to share some context as far as what seems to be happening, so maybe you can navigate through it to get the preferable outcome. I have also handled a similar situation before. I am also not defending or condoning the behavior, but hoping to simply provide context. If I had to guess, the company's HR department did an investigation based on the information you provided. They spoke to Frank, reviewed the text messages, and likely spoke to Paul's boss, as well as depending what Paul shared with them. Unfortunately, deleting the harassing text messages is a very big problem. This leaves you with evidence of an overzealous employee in out-of-work communication, but not outwardly inappropriate, and a series of incredibly inappropriate texts that cannot be validated who they are coming from. Because it cannot be proven who is sending them, they will not terminate. It also sounds like your HR department doesn't have the authority to terminate, and it is actually your legal department blocking it. Again, because there may not be enough evidence from a legal point of view, this is essentially a he said/he said scenario. They come up frequently, and often companies are concerned moving forward without definitive evidence. I think this is kind of BS and believe in more of a zero tolerance approach when they were allegedly some red flags, but here we are. It's likely they gave Frank a formal warning. I'm surprised they did not assure your husband that Frank won't be in contact unless it's purely for work-related reasons, etc. Not advising you what or if any action is taken as a result of an investigation is typical and standard across any company. The crux of this entire situation isn't if the behavior is acceptable, but who is doing it. I will also say I think Paul's HR department believes him and just can't take action because of legal. It is weird to me that they would tell him they found any red flags, to be honest. I don't find why that is relevant information to share, particularly if they aren't taking decisive action. It just creates more concern for you and your husband. So here's what I recommend you can reasonably do. Number 1, if he hasn't already, talk to his boss and explain fully what is happening. If he has a decent relation with his boss's boss, also tell him. Not from a I want action to happen perspective, but more of so I'm afraid and out of options. Getting people in his corner, particularly who have observed some of Frank's previous behavior, is important. I agree with others. Focusing on the fact that he doesn't feel safe in or outside of work is the correct angle. Number 2, document everything. If Paul's reached out to directly by Frank at work, etc., keep the text messages in case he incriminates himself. Number 3, you could attempt to get a restraining order. Truthfully, I don't know how easy or difficult these are. You might be told that there needs to be more evidence. If it gets approved, it does force your company to take some action. It's very complicated for an employer to manage and would hopefully validate the claims. Number 4, finally, you may want to consider some safety planning. Consider changing your phone numbers. It looks like you did everything you can at home. Don't respond to the messages or engage with Frank. Concerning behavior like this can escalate. This is very good advice. First, Paul should talk to his boss and explain in detail everything that is happening, as well as documenting everything, and consider safety planning such as changing their phone numbers as this Redditor suggested. Another Redditor would also give some amazing advice with them stating, "This won't help with tracking the number down, but I suggest putting everything together in an email to HR and copying yourself personal email so that you have record. I would start it out with, as I reported to you on 00/2020, I would have a paper trail in case the company decides to turn on the wrong person. He needs to leave and needs to fight for unemployment, or you someday need to take legal action." That sounds extremely disturbing. I hope that someone is able to help you catch this guy. This is good advice. Paul could use this tactic to keep everything documented with dates as the situation unfolds. Another Redditor would also give some great advice with him stating, Number 1, his job should do more to protect him, however legally, unless it's his boss, you probably don't have a case for harassment, as power has to be an element in most jurisdictions. But don't trust someone on the internet when it comes to legal matters. Consult with a local employment law attorney. An initial consultation should be free. Number 2, there's a 50-50 chance that the restraining order can be a great idea but could also be disastrous. It could trigger a bigger escalation. You need information. Most stalkers like this have stalked before, and truthfully probably won't stop unless they get serious mental health treatment, go to jail for something, move away, or pick another victim. I recommend hiring a PI at this stage. Is your stalker on probation? If so, it may be as simple as containing his probation officer to have him sent back to jail. Does he have outstanding warrants, hopefully in another state? Basically, you want anything that you can use to direct his life/focus away from you. Also, get a hold of his criminal history. Has he assaulted people before? Followed up on threats? Sometimes it's nothing, but I also know people who had to move and put their home under a corporation so they wouldn't be found. Finally, research family and have the PI interview them for a full picture of their history/how involved the family can be/how much control the family will exert. Are they looking for him? Do they want to have him evaluated under a 5150? Can they tell you about stalking that wasn't reported to the police? And a good PI will come up with a story so none of this is connected to you. It seems like a lot, but this kind of background check is fairly routine for a PI to conduct. Isn't that expensive and should put you in a much better position to figure out possible ways to deal with the situation. Good luck. I think this is good advice. OP could hire a private investigator to help with investigating for this situation. Eventually, after all of this, however, there wouldn't be a further update from OP. Until about 11 hours later, OP would make a whole new post detailing an update. That update is as follows. Update. A former coworker is using burner numbers to harass my husband and acting obsessive. My husband is still away on his business trip, but will be returning home tonight. Paul does plan to get a new phone number once he returns home. We discussed filing for an order of protection. One source of comfort is that we have a PO box and our street address we rent is not available online. With a restraining order, we would have to disclose our address. We're weighing the pros and cons. My husband and I spoke this morning and he filled me in on a few new details. His boss called him last night after he sent her screenshots of the text from the VOIP. They have a great working relationship and she disclosed a few things that she wasn't necessarily supposed to share. Legal was not able to link the VOIP text and calls to Frank. There have been 2 separate numbers that we know of that have been used to harass my husband. Paul used Spokeo to look up the information if both numbers are owned by the company Envoy. My husband's boss suggested that the next time he receives a phone call from the VOIP number to answer and record the conversation. I don't know if he should do that. If anyone knows how to search VOIP numbers so we can connect them to Frank, that would be a huge help. After Frank was placed at his new office last December, he has repeatedly asked to transfer back to my husband's branch. Paul is well regarded within his company and next in line for a promotion. During Frank's training, he would often make comments about how alike they were. Paul thought Frank was referring to their similar background in business. However, I searched online and Frank might have lied about some of his previous work experience. Physically, personality-wise, and familial background, they are very different. I don't think the harassment is just based on attraction. There have been several messages where Frank calls my husband his friend and mentor, which is bizarre because they only worked together for 5 weeks. There were a few comments about Paul deleting the initial text from Frank. I was also frustrated by his decision, but I understand why. Paul had a rough childhood and his first instinct is to avoid conflict. The text made him feel so uncomfortable he didn't want to open his messages and see them. He had hoped that they could forget what had happened. However, the situation escalated. To be clear, those were the only inappropriate texts sent directly from Frank's number. His subsequent messages say things like, "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Hey, how's it going?" The texts from VoIP are explicit. There are similarities in verbiage and format from Frank's text, Facebook post, and the VoIP text. I did do some research on Frank. I searched our state's court dockets and found that he was arrested for a DUI a month before he started work at that company. Paul's boss had previously complained that Frank was repeatedly messaging her about when his background check would be completed when he was hired. She thought it was suspicious, but nothing was flagged. At one point during training, Frank texted a coworker from a random number. The coworker asked if it was an alternative contact and Frank explained that it was his smartwatch. When everything happened, I tried to find as much info as possible. When I googled his primary number, nothing came up. However, the coworker shared the smartwatch number, which is listed online as Frank's primary contact for the past 2 decades. It also shows several numbers attached to Frank's name, and it is noted next to one of them that it is a VoIP. There were previous addresses linked to Frank's phone number. According to one address, a Frank L. Smith and a Frank L. Miller lived at the same residence with the same people. I looked up both of those names and they have different birth dates within a few years of each other. I was curious because Frank had told my husband he was divorced and I thought perhaps he had changed his last name. Frank L. Smith had the same birth date as the court docket I found. The biggest thing my husband's boss told him was Frank recently asked for an out-of-state transfer which is currently being processed but not certain. Paul has mixed feelings about this. He first felt relieved but then frustrated that the company's approach was to make Frank someone else's problem, and it doesn't guarantee that it will stop. After this update, there wouldn't be a further one from OP. Hopefully the situation resolved itself and this guy stopped harassing OP's husband. But alright, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. What did you think of this post? Did you think it was real or fake? Personally, I think it could be real. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. But as always,
Have a nice day.